call this meeting to order. Welcome back. I know you're really excited to be here today.
We are. Absolutely.
We had a good rest then.
There you go.
Okay, so can I have, I want to adopt the minutes of the last meeting. Oh, sorry, first of all, disclosure of pecuniary interest. Being none. A motion to approve the minutes of June 12th, 2017. All in favor? Opposed? It's carried. And also the adoption of the minutes for June 12th, the closed session minutes, 2017. All in favor? Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. So, pulled on today's agenda is 4.1, 4.2, 4.4, 4.7, 4.8, and 4.13. So can I have a motion to approve the measure? All in favor? Opposed? Carried. So, Councillor Brown, you pulled 4.1 and 4.2.
Yes, I just have one question. I just wondered if the benefit package was the same as what it was renewed, if not been any reductions in benefits or additions.
No, the benefit carrier would have to match our benefits today exactly as they are, so there would be no reduction. To say there might not be any increase, there may be some that are a little bit better, but everything that we have today you would currently have.
Okay, that's all.
Okay.
Are there any other questions?
I'll
Thank
move
you.
it.
All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Okay, 4.2, Councillor Brown?
I just have to get it. Has Finance Department looked into this and to see how much of a percentage increase it could be on the property tax base next year?
Yeah, through the chair, the increase is somewhere between 1.7 to 2.2% on top of the 1.75. So it'd be outside of the base budget increase.
So I'm assuming that finance and all departments will be looking for ways to reduce this.
Well, it is what it is. This is legislation, and we are obligated to meet that and to budget appropriately for it. We had, in our report for future tax rates, we had spoken on the requirement that legislative changes will not be able to be met under the 1.75 annual property tax increase.
So that you haven't looked at it in the aspect of reducing employees, reducing some of the programs, because that's where basically our 10 people are employed, I would suspect.
Right. So we would, through the chair, we would have to seek council's endorsement to reduce levels of service such as that. At this time, I've had no direction on reducing levels of services and reducing programs. You know, we will do our best through the budget process, as we always do, to bring the best budget we can for you. We'll bring you more information when we do the general levy forecast in November.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Motion to approve? Oh,
I pulled it.
You pulled it? Well, I pulled it as well. Councillor Collar, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of my questions were asked. When I read this report, I was blown away. I mean, I guess my question, first of all, is this wouldn't come into place till after the next provincial election. Is that correct?
No, through the chair, the first stage of it is
Starting
effective
now?
January 1st, 2018.
So this is about the time of year where we usually discuss the guideline, and I think we'd already agreed to set it at 1.75.
Correct.
So we're now at 3.5 to 4, somewhere around there.
Well, when we bring you the general levy forecast, we'll bring you better information on.
But it's around
percentages.
that 3.5 to 4%.
Yes.
I didn't realize, like, I was really surprised we have this many part-time staff, because this only applies to the minimum wage area, right? And I know our parks departments and summer programs and those sorts of things are, so I was really surprised. That's about 800 to, no, what was it, $1.1 million in the first year alone.
Yeah. Through the chair, there's a couple, it's not just the minimum wage. You have to understand too, there's kind of that, I call it the accordion effect, right? So when you're raising one group, other groups, you have to keep that same gap between them. As well, there is the equal pay for equal work. So that changes, some of our part-time where we have equivalencies in full-time. That legislation and the rules and regulations is not fully clear yet. We're still reviewing that.
Can you go back to the accordion effect for
Yeah.
a second? Where does it say that if we increase one level, we have to increase the other level and maintain that band?
Do you want to get that?
That's not in the legislation.
We have internal equity and inequity issues that you have to look at. So we have a pay schedule where all of our part-time jobs are looked at, they're evaluated, they're put in within a certain band, right? And you have a spread between those bands. A lot of them were based off of minimum wage to start when we looked at this going back years ago when we looked at how you pay your part-time. So by increasing the minimum wage, you've now added $3 to $4 on what we're paying everybody, which means anybody that's in this level, that's an entry level, are now going to be higher than people in other bands where we've rated them and evaluated them. For equity purposes and pay equity purposes, they're within that band. So you've got to adjust all of those other bands.
Are our part-time people, they're not part of the union?
No, we're one of the only municipalities in the area that are not unionized for our part-time group or our students.
So hypothetically, if you're a staff person working somewhere in the town and you're making $16 an hour, and this comes in and goes up to 15, you're going to go from 16 to 18, 19? Is that what you're saying is going to?
Not necessarily. We looked at the pay bands and we had to adjust them accordingly. So if there was a $2 gap, you need to maintain that $2 gap going through. If it was a $1 gap, you tried to maintain it. In some cases, we actually lowered the gap a little bit. We were able to lower it in some of the bands, but not all of the bands.
And does that go all the way up to the top?
All the way up to the top.
You know what I mean? If this person's making 16, this person's 17, this one's 18, they all incrementally jump until it stops? Like at what point
Yes.
does that band not apply?
To us.
To us, obviously.
That's so
Hopefully
true.
Keith's listening and writes that down, but, no, really, seriously.
They're
this is-
they're still within their bands. We haven't moved them band-wise, it's just dollar-wise. You can't have people that are in one band lower, potentially getting more as a start rate or that than your next band. So that's where it's always adjusted. It should only adjust this one time. We've looked at it, and with the adjustments we made, even if they increase, it shouldn't affect us going forward.
I don't think that's anything that anybody foresaw, that's domino effect or accordion effect, as we call it.
That's right.
It has been in the paper, and it has been at a few news conferences that I've seen. And, it happens because you can't take a position that has been rated differently than a position and suddenly everybody's the same. So it has that little push up.
Well, I guess the difference is part-time, full-time. I mean, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have any full-time people making minimum wage, do we?
No.
No. So this is only part-time.
Correct.
I'm just not seeing the correlation between the part-time, full-time, and the need to adjust across the board.
Well,
Me personally, I'm not saying it's not written somewhere, but I'm just saying I'm just having trouble putting that together.
where the full-time piece comes in is where they're equating work. So if you have part-time work, that's exactly the same as full-time work. Those have to be equivalent. But we're still working through that piece of legislation. So we've tried to give you a range knowing that there'll be a little bit difference in the impact, but it will be up there.
Okay, thank you. Learn something new every day.
Yes, thank you. And all municipalities across Ontario will be facing the same issues, so we're all in the same boat. I wanted to ask, we have some reserves for impacts that are unexpected. Would this be a situation that would meet the criteria to dip into that reserve to more or less mitigate it? In other words, phase it in, the impact on the tax rate?
I think the danger is that you're going to have the same problem again in 19 then as well, because we have another increase to $15 an hour on January 1st, 2019. That's only in effect till September 30th, 2019, so you're going to get double hit in 19 as well. When you use the reserve, the working reserve for that, it just means you're paying later. That's what it means. It's spreading out the impact, and you have to somehow wean yourself off that. The last time we did that, I think, was when the interest rates in 2008 fell. No, it was earlier than that. It was soon just after. It was just in the early 2000s, and we succeeded not to do that since then. We're going to look at all the possibilities we can to mitigate. And like I said, when we have, it's a lot of analysis, and as we get through the general levy forecast, we'll bring some more information to council at that time.
Thank you. Just one more this straight. So this doesn't include library services? Do we have any idea how much of an impact that will be, or when we'll get that information?
We're just starting to work on that. It won't be like the town's impact. It won't nearly be as large as the town's impact, but I can't even give you a guess right now.
Yeah.
But we will bring that.
Time.
Yeah, they have a lot of part-time, but they're on different wage scales in the town. They have their own wage scales, so they won't have as large an impact as we do. But we are working on that, and again, we'll bring you that on the general levy forecast.
Thank you. Any more questions? Okay, motion to receive. All in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Thank you. The next one pulled was on page 22. It's 4.4. Mrs. Cooper, you had a comment about that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I've become aware that more than one member has a conflict for the February 26, 2018 council meeting. So what's been proposed is that instead that council meeting be moved to the evening of February 20th. So we would have a GGC that afternoon and then council in the chambers in the evening, which I know is a little bit unpopular with the awkward kind of dinner break in between, but it's in my mind preferable to having just sort of that special council ratifying in the River Plate room, because then we lose that meeting for delegations and also for our budget chair to make some comments on the passage of the budget. So from a clerk's perspective, I don't have any objections to what's being proposed, so I just thought I would put that out there, and if anyone wanted to make a motion for that change, then
Which date was that?
Pardon me?
What was the date again?
So the February 26th council meeting would be held on the evening of February 20th.
What is the problem? I'm not clear of that.
There's a couple of council members that are going to be away and unable to attend that meeting.
Oh, okay.
I don't have that.
So can I have a motion for that? Councilor Brown, all in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Motion to approve the report? Thank you. All in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Okay, the next one on the agenda that was pulled is 4.7. It's on page 34. Councilor Jordan?
I just wanted to ask, there seem to be a number of issues with this project, and unfortunately it went over budget. Was there anything that we could have done to prevent this from happening? Or was it a Murphy's Law? Or just a little more explanation? Is there anything?
There was poor materials under the culvert, which you can't do boreholes for that. And then we had a lot of rain, which contaminated the stockpiles and the earth that was there. So there's a lot of weather-related and unforeseen conditions under the culverts. Potentially more boreholes may have found some other bad soils, but a lot of it's just what happens out on site.
Well, it's unfortunate, but just nothing we could do there.
It's to get it done.
Okay, I'll move. Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Thank you.
Stay for the next one.
Okay. All right. I've got the next one on the list that was pulled was 4.8. Councilor Collier, and that's on page 40.
Yeah, just the park and walkway, what was it called?
Duffins.
anyway, the survey on the poll that was done, did they note any new installations? 'Cause that's not in here as far as new installs around the town.
No, they just assessed the condition of the steel poles at the time.
How do we discuss new locations with staff? Do you want those just on a one-off as we go? Because I understand upkeeping all, but if we're going to do it, I think we need to look at some new locations. We have a number of places, and I'll use, for instance, the, from, I guess it's McGill, that section, by the McLean Community Center. And where the trail crosses McGill there is not lit. It's been requested that there be a light standard put in there years ago. And it's not on the report, and it's not in the study. So when do we look at those types of things?
We would create a capital project to infill walkway lighting, to look at that.
So that's not underway in any respect right now? Okay. Yes, I'll follow up with maybe Ms. Strain on that one then. Thank you.
I have a motion to receive. Okay, all in favor? Any opposed? Carried. Thank you. Okay, moving to 4.13, which is on page 88 of the agenda. Councilor Jordan.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask, first of all, when do we expect our officers will be trained to use the Narcon, and when they'll have it available? When do we anticipate that we'll be prepared to deal with opioid?
Once we get the approval from council, the training will take place almost immediately, and by about the end of October, we'll be ready to have it on the trucks and use it.
That's good to hear. Also, you're working with other groups through the region and dealing with this issue?
That's right, through the chair to Councilor Jordan. Unfortunately, we're not really working with other groups. We work under the base hospital as far as our medical aspects of our job, and of course under a doctor's license through an agreement. But the opioid concern is more of a regional with that health services and the police. From our perspective, we're going to have the availability, much like we've done with other things in the past, where we can assist the public if they come in contact with an opioid and there's a danger. Then the Narcon that we will be carrying and trained to use will certainly help that. As I said, it's not so much that we work with the other partners on the opioid situation. We just are very limited in what we can do from the fire service.
I see. I know that I saw somewhere that some emergency services were calling on the province to declare this an emergency, I think, to direct more resources to this situation. Are you aware of that, and what any response has been?
Yes, again, through the chair of the council, Jordan. There has been some requests, but that's come from the regional level, and it's come from the social services, and what they're asking for is the provincial government to offer them more ability to provide better education on the situation and so on. But it's from the regional to the province through the social services, so it's not in our purview as far as the fire service, and we certainly haven't, from a fire service in Ontario, requested assistance from the government. This again, it falls within our medical field, and these type of things, and as we're going to see other different ones in the future, we're unfortunately more reactive as to when there is a problem, and then we look for a solution in training and assist in having the problem go away.
Well, I'm pleased to move this because I think it's essential that our firefighters be trained and also have this available. I'm pleased to hear that.
Are there any other questions? So moved. All in favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Thank you. So we're moving on to the presentations. 6.1 on page 92 of your agenda, the community PCP update. Jade, thank you. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me here this afternoon. I'm here to provide an update on the community greenhouse gas inventory and trends, an analysis that was conducted using 2015 as the baseline year. So just to give a little bit of background, greenhouse gas emissions are the precursor to climate change, and they comprise of a number of different atmospheric gases because they contribute to the greenhouse effect by absorbing infrared radiation, which produces solar warming of the Earth's surface. And a number of these greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, in which sources include transportation and the burning of fossil fuels, methane, which primarily comes from agriculture, natural gas systems, and landfills. Nitrous oxide, again, looking at our transportation system, manufacturing, and agriculture. We've also got hydrofluorocarbons, parafluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and water vapor. And when I talk about greenhouse gas emissions through the rest of this presentation, I am referring collectively to these emissions as a whole. Greenhouse gas emissions are very important as they have an impact on climate and, of course, climate change. Greenhouse gases act like a blanket, absorbing the sun's radiation and preventing it from escaping into the outer atmosphere. The net effect is the gradual heating of the Earth's atmosphere and surface, a process known as global warming. Human activity, such as burning fossil fuels, causes more greenhouse gas emissions to build up in the atmosphere. And as the atmosphere thickens with more greenhouse gas emissions, more heat is held in. Fossil fuels, such as oil, coal, and natural gas, are high in carbon and other greenhouse gases, and when burned, produce major amounts of carbon dioxide, or CO2, which results in an accelerated warming of the planet. And to give a little bit of history with the greenhouse gas effect, this is a NASA climate time machine. It is a US-based climate research model, and it shows the level of global temperature warming over the past 100 years, starting from 1884, the Industrial Revolution. So as you can see, as we move into the 1900s, the polar areas highlighted in blue are the cooler areas of the planet, and anywhere in orange and red demonstrates some warming temperatures. We move into the 1930s, where we're really starting to ramp up our industrial revolution. You can see specifically over North America, we're really starting to see that global warming take effect. Moving forward into 1950, the Northern Hemisphere is very strongly highlighting that warming effect over the Northern Hemisphere. In the 1970s, you're seeing more of a global impact. So those emissions that have been released into the atmosphere over the past 40 to 50 years are now starting to have a global impact on the planet. And this is us in 2016. And as you can see, global warming doesn't take place equally across the planet, but we have seen over the past 100 to 200 years an average 4-degree increase across the globe already. And why do we care about climate change? Well, unfortunately, climate change has a number of impacts onto our day-to-day life, as well as our weather and the natural environment. We see things such as changing rain and snow patterns, very similar to what we're seeing down south of us right now. We have changes in animal and migration life cycles. We have less snow and ice, which results in rising sea levels, more acidic oceans, and the ability to absorb less carbon. We see higher temperatures, more heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and severe storms, and changes in plant life cycles, to name a few. Here in Ontario, we have a number of climate projections, and in summary, these will include an increase in annual temperature, or more hot days above 30 degrees Celsius over the next 20 to 30 years, an increase in average annual precipitation with a general decrease in summer, with the exception of extreme events, and an increase in extreme events, weather events including heavy rainfall, ice storms, windstorms, and tornadoes as such. Ajax has done an extensive amount of work to reduce greenhouse gases so far within its community. And back in 2010, the town of Ajax joined the ICLEI Federation of Canadian Municipalities, or FCM, as partners for the Climate Protection Program. We have two streams where we have joined this program. There is the corporate stream, which I brought you an update back in the spring of this year. And I'm here today to talk about the community side and where we have got with the PCP program to date. There are 5 milestones for this program, and they include conducting a baseline greenhouse gas inventory and forecast up to 2020. We set targets. We've also developed a local action plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To date, we have implemented a number of those actions, and today I am bringing you the measurement progress and report results that will allow us to achieve milestone 5. So the community greenhouse gas reduction target is 6% by the year 2020. So this is baseline year. We would reduce our absolute emissions by 2005. And back in 2005, our annual emissions were 521,250 tons of eCO2, or carbon dioxide equivalent. So you can imagine that as about 521,000 giraffes. And in order to meet that target, we would need to reduce our emissions by 31,275 tons by the year 2020. And to give you an overview, since 2005, our baseline study showed that the majority of our emissions were as a result of residential activities. So this would be heating your home or using electricity to source your equipment within your home. 31% was your institutional, commercial sectors. So you're looking at your manufacturing, your office buildings, schools, and multi-residential buildings. 4% of our greenhouse gas emissions came from community waste, and 26% came from transportation. In 2015, our greenhouse gas emissions increased on the residential side by sector. 45% is now coming from HX residents, and we are looking at 34% from industrial, commercial, and institutional. We are now able, with advancements in data collection, to be able to split that up into more detailed information, and 18% is coming from transportation. I must note that transportation solely focuses on journeys that are made within the community, and with Ajax being fairly small, those distances are very limited, and we do not include other modes of transportation that take place outside of the community, regardless of them actually being driven by the community. For example, if you're taking a flight to New York for a vacation, or if you're taking the train to Toronto, that falls outside of the scope of the greenhouse gas inventory. So in 2015, 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions within the Ajax community is as a result of electricity, which is very surprising considering electric in Ontario is fairly carbon neutral, being primarily generated from nuclear energy, which is a carbon-free source or a greenhouse gas-free source. But due to the sheer amount that we consume with this community, it does make up the majority of emissions by source, followed closely by natural gas, and then of course our transportation fuels, which are gasoline, diesel, and propane. When you look at a comparison of how much greenhouse gas emission sources, where they come from, and then the prices equivalent to that, you may be surprised to see that 86% of the total cost that we spend on greenhouse gas emissions come from electricity, despite it only being 60% of the total greenhouse gas emissions that we consume. So you can see that there is not an equal consumption of fuel source by fuel price. And of course those fuels, particularly electricity, has increased dramatically over the past 10 years. You can see this here, comparison of cost by sector. The residential sector is paying on average 2.5 times in energy cost from 2005. The institutional commercial sector is around triple the cost. We've all had discussions around global adjustment and things that have driven those costs up. The only reduction in price you have seen is in the transportation sector. And in 2005, the average price for fuel was around $1.24, whereas in 2015, when we did this study, it was around 99 cents per liter. So you can see that this is the only sector we have seen a decrease in cost for energy production. And here you'll see the final graph for this presentation. And this is a comparison of our absolute emissions from 2005 to 2015. I am pleased to announce that we have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions, and we have dropped from 5.9 per capita tons of CO2 equivalent in 2005 down to just 3.7 in 2015. And in 2015, the Ajax community generated 443,189 tons of CO2, and this is a reduction of 78,061 tons. So we have met and have achieved our goal of 6% reduction by the year 2020, 5 years early. That being said, it is important to note the last column on this chart where it says the BAU. If we continue on the path as business as usual today, our greenhouse gas emissions will still continue to increase, and that's as a result of population growth. We still need to make significant changes in order to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to be able to achieve the provincial greenhouse gas reduction targets of 80% reduction by the year 2050, as well as aim to keep our global temperature increase below the 2-degree mark, which was determined by the United Nations at COP21 back in 2015 as being of utmost importance in order to ensure that humanity remains the same and is not impacted at a severe state by climate change. So in conclusion, Ajax community produced 443,189 tons of carbon dioxide in 2015. It's a 15% decrease since 2005, when we produced 521,250 tons. And this reduction is significant despite our growth of 33.2% during that time period. And it does suggest that we have met the 6% greenhouse gas emission reduction target, and we have achieved milestone 5 under the FCM PC program. So my final slide is our next steps. And in order to continue to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, it is recommended that the town's community local action plan be updated to highlight future projects and programs. And in addition, the town should consider setting targets that allow for ongoing community greenhouse gas emission reduction beyond the year 2020. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the presentation. I would, if you could,
I can open it back up.
okay. I would imagine there is a layer of greenhouse gases that's acceptable, and at the same time, like acceptable in terms of protecting us from radiation from the sun and from emitting, not emitting too much heat into the atmosphere. Is that the ultimate goal, to get to that layer? Because there's always going to be some greenhouse gases.
Through the chair, absolutely. There are natural causes of the greenhouse effect, just through the natural cycles, whether it be the evaporation of our oceans that have water vapor in them, or whether it be the natural forest fires emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. These are natural sources. The concern that is brought upon us is the fact that due to industrial process consumption of fuels, we are putting significantly more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, and therefore we're kind of meddling with those natural cycles and heating up the planet far more quickly than we've ever seen in the history of the planet.
And at the residential end, I think there was a large percentage. That's where the majority of the gases are coming from, or was it the industrial? I thought it was the residential.
With the scope of this particular inventory and the methodology that's used, it does suggest that residential is the main factor for greenhouse gas emissions for the Ajax community. Again, we've got to look at it from a fuel source. Majority of people are using natural gas and electricity to heat and run their homes.
So in terms of, I guess, planning and our building this industry, that message is being communicated to them, and is there something more that we could do through the planning process, building permit process to help reduce that number further?
There is a number of initiatives currently underway to help reinforce our stance on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the community, and we believe that planning will be providing an update by the end of the year.
Thank you.
Mr. Collier?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Jade, for the presentation. Can you quantify what we're spending per year on our program to reduce greenhouse gases? I know, like, you've listed several pages here. Page 125 goes on for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 pages of different initiatives and things. Do we have a ballpark number of what we're spending on an annual basis?
With the community greenhouse gas inventory, not all of the funding that has gone towards these projects are actually generated by the town. A number of the initiatives have been run by the region, for example, with their DRT transit system, or Viridian with their microgrid projects. So in order to quantify specifically all of the actions for the community side, that would be outside of our jurisdiction.
Well, I mean, we're doing a number of things. Like we have LEED certified buildings.
Yeah.
We have hybrid vehicles. We have charging stations. We have a number of different things. So
again,
the town only.
That is very specific to the corporate greenhouse gas emission inventory, which I brought forward back in the spring of this year. And there is there is budgets that has been tied to each of one of those projects. And within the corporate energy management plan, the 5-year forecast for reducing energy and, of course, therefore greenhouse gas emissions is tied within that plan. So it's available in that document.
Okay, but you don't have that number.
No, off the top of my head.
Okay. I imagine it's in the hundreds of thousands, so it's a large number.
It's fairly significant,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, by reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions, we are also reducing our operating costs.
Okay, and I think we always, like, Ajax is pretty much ahead of the curve in most things, especially environmental things. So we're doing our part, and depending who you talk to, you go south of the border and there's a president that feels global warming doesn't exist. So we're doing.
That's the model I showed you. The United States.
I'm not saying he's right. I'm just saying what I'm trying. I guess I'm trying to get at, and I'll use Mayor Parrish's analogy with the spit in the ocean. I've heard before. I mean, we're doing all these things, and yet we've got some of our trading partners. I know China and the U.S. are doing nothing, and if anything, they're ramping up their contributions with coal plants and a number of other things. So how does that affect what we're doing? I mean, are we banging our head against the wall here, even though we're making progress locally?
There is definitely a lot of discomfort with what is happening south of the border at this time with discussions surrounding climate change. However, if you look towards Europe and look towards Asia, they are still standing by the means that we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to protect us in terms of humanity beyond the year 2030 to 2050. If we don't make these changes now, we are going to be dealing with situations that are beyond our control. So I think the grown-up thing to do, perhaps, is to continue with our plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and do the best we can so that we are not contributing to the detrimental.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing. I absolutely agree that we have. It's just, it feels like we're being sabotaged by some of these. And when you've got, is it UN or whoever it is that's putting this forward, there's no control over these big players. And then we look at forest fires, like what's happening in BC right now. And I read an article where one forest fire can undo all the global warming or all the greenhouse gas reduction strategies that Canada does in a year. And we have, I don't know how many thousand forest fires a year. So it's kind of like one of those 1 inch forward, 2 inch backs kind of things.
Certainly a very challenging, probably one of the most complex issues any of us will ever have to deal with. So what we can do is do the best we can, continue to reduce our impacts and demonstrate leadership, hoping that other people will follow us.
Okay. I wouldn't mind knowing that number, though, if you're able to provide it later, please. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Councilor Jordan? Thank you, and it's good to hear that we've done well, even as the community's grown. First I want to comment about the U.S. president, that I don't think we should just assume that because the president doesn't seem to be on board, the U.S., there's many mayors and leaders at other levels of government who are very much involved in doing things in their areas to address climate change, which is a good thing. And so I just want to talk about the residential. I know at FCM there was a community built at Plessville in Quebec who their municipality actually, I know our treasurer will probably choke on this, offer what they called eco renovation loans to their residents. So it was loans that they said don't appear on the books of the municipality. So I don't know how they do that, but that are paid back over 10 to 20 years. I think it's added on the taxes, I'm not sure. Have you heard of any initiatives like that?
Through Chair. Yes, there's a number of initiatives, and more locally, the City of Toronto offers a similar service. We are currently exploring, well, actually the region of Durham is currently exploring that opportunity through their climate adaptation plans. They feel that they may have the more ability to take on something like that. It requires a lot of administration and a lot of inspections and going out to homes to see if those renovations can be done. We're also very fortunate in Ontario, whereas we have the Save on Energy programs, which are run by the Independent Electricity Provider of Ontario, IESO, where you can get an audit done on your home, and if they determine a list of retrofits that can be happened, they can then apply for funding. There's a number of new programs that are being launched by Enbridge and by our local utility company already as well, that are eligible for all residents, regardless of what utilities you use. So it may not be something that we necessarily need to look into, knowing that other jurisdictions are really kind of taking care of.
Yes, I mean, I think when you see the residential, it can be overwhelming for people, even to know where to start and what to do, and then looking at, can I afford this on top of my mortgage and everything else. So I think that's where everyone's going back to.
And we're heavily promoting those programs to help get the communications out to our residents, because I think sometimes that is probably one of the biggest barriers. People don't know these programs already exist.
Thank you. I wanted to just ask on, this is the whole issue of mitigation. What, and I don't expect an answer, but do we have a tracking system of what we're doing as far as adaptation and where we are on that sort of deal?
Yes, so we have applied for funding as per my update back in the spring through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities climate adaptation funding. I'm hoping to hear by the end of the month as to whether we are successful. And we have also identified a project in 2018 to conduct a climate adaptation plan.
Well, I want to hear that. I hope that we're successful, because I think that's essential. I mean, we're seeing the effects of climate change, and we need to adapt faster, because we're not going to solve climate change down fast enough. So we have to work quickly on the adaptation environment. So I hope we are, and if you can report back on that, I would like to know that.
Any other questions? Just wanted to say thank you for the work you've done in this.
I wanted to say thank you to Danielle. She's been our intern from Western University. She did a lot of work on this project.
Thank you, Danielle. I know we've seen a number or decrease in smog alert days in Toronto here since we changed actually from the coal-fired to the gas-fired plants. So if anything, even if you doubt the climate change information you're getting, it does help with the overall health of the residents, because it cleans the air. There's an awful lot of young people who are on puffers and have difficulty breathing. So it makes a huge difference in the overall health. So thank you. Can I have a motion to approve recommendation? All in favor? Any opposed? Carried. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Sawchuk, you're up. On the list of the non-designated heritage properties on page 138 of your agenda.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. So I'm here to speak to you today about the consultation process to obtain input on the transition of non-designated heritage properties from the heritage inventory to the heritage register. The presentation will be broken up into three main sections. The first is essentially an overview of a few existing tools, those being the heritage register, the Town of Ajax heritage inventory, and looking into the reasons why we should be protecting non-designated properties. The middle portion of the presentation will be really looking in detail at heritage registers. So the rationale or benefits of the register, some of the myths out there surrounding heritage registers, as well as the process for transitioning from the inventory to the heritage register. And then finally, I will conclude with an overview of the proposed consultation strategy and then recap the conclusion and recommendations from the report. So Section 27 of the Ontario Heritage Act requires that municipalities keep a directory of all heritage properties, and this is typically referred to as the Heritage Register. The Heritage Register must include all properties designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. So this includes all properties individually designated under Part 4, as well as districts of properties designated under Part 5 of the Act. In 2005, the Act was amended to allow municipalities to add non-designated properties to their heritage registers. And the rationale for this is that heritage registers are supposed to be a comprehensive directory of all heritage properties, whether or not they are designated or undesignated. And in Ajax, our heritage register is actually presented as Appendix A in the official plan. And it currently includes 29 properties designated under Part 4 of the Act, and one district, Pickering Village, that's designated under Part 5 of the Act. So I think part of the reason why there wasn't an initial push back in 2005 to jump right towards expanding the Heritage Register is that for a very long time we've had sort of well-established informal heritage inventory in place in the town. And this really dates back to the early 1990s when staff and the Heritage Advisory Committee put together a list of both designated and non-designated properties. But this was essentially any property that was deemed to have potential heritage value. And there was no criteria, just whenever it was discovered that there was an older property in the town, that would be added to the list. So I mentioned here that it's a fluid document, and what I mean by that is it's been entirely administrated at the staff level. So as new properties have been discovered, they've been added. At the same time as properties have been demolished, that status update has been made on the informal inventory. Now, despite its informal status, the existing heritage inventory does have real implications for land use planning, and the reason for that is the definitions of built heritage resources in the official plan. And in the official plan, it says that any heritage properties on a municipal list are considered to be heritage properties for the intents and purposes of the OP policies. So our existing informal heritage inventory functions very much like a heritage register, but there are two major exceptions there. The first one is that there's no council input into addition or removal of properties. I just mentioned on the previous slide that this is entirely handled at the staff level. But more importantly, there's no mechanism to control demolition of non-designated properties. So over the roughly quarter-century period that we've had this informal inventory together, there's been about 250 properties added. Now, over that same period, we've lost more than a third of those properties to demolition. So 85 properties have experienced demolition. It's estimated that that would include around 200 buildings because many of these properties were rural properties with both homes and barns and other outbuildings. But what it really means to us is that many of the town's most significant heritage properties are currently unprotected from demolition. And just to provide a bit of a sort of visual overview, I've included some of those properties which currently have no protection from demolition. So this property here is the Rogers Cornell Richardson House, built in 1842 by the son of Timothy Rogers. So significant heritage value there. This property here is known as Willow Hollow, and it's one of the older stone buildings or stone homes that we have left in the town. This one built approximately 1850. It's also some more recent buildings, but still, equally as important from a historical perspective. This was one of the management houses from DIL. So there are a number of these houses still located on Churchill Road, and they are unprotected from demolition. Stepping away from the residential side of things, this is a place of worship. It was built as St. Andrew's Presbyterian in 1891, which is unprotected from demolition. Then the last example, perhaps the most significant architectural building in town. This is called Stonehaven, and it was built in 1927 and designed by an architect, Henry Sproat, who's actually at least nationally renowned, if not internationally renowned. He's also the architect of the Royal York downtown, Princess Margaret Hospital, a number of U of T buildings, as well as College Park. So the reasons for implementing the expansion of the Heritage Register, transitioning non-designated properties to the Heritage Register will, number one, provide interim protection against demolition. So there's a mechanism within the Ontario Heritage Act that says that when a building is listed on the Heritage Register, there must be a 60-day review period prior to processing that demolition request. What this 60 days really does for the town is it gives the town an opportunity to do any studies or any reports that are required to fully understand the value of that property and decide whether or not heritage designation is warranted. So that 60 days is a lot longer than the typical 10-day review period for residential properties. Another benefit of the Heritage Register is that it ensures council has some sort of authority over the properties that are added and removed, and it really formalizes those processes. And then thirdly here, a benefit is that it results in a single comprehensive directory of all heritage properties. So this would be instead of the current situation where we have our official Heritage Register included in the official plan, and then a separate document known as the Heritage Inventory, which is sort of an offline document for tracking non-designated properties. So there is a lot of misinformation out there about heritage registers, and I wanted to tackle that head on in this presentation. The first myth is that listing on the Heritage Register is the same as designation. This is not the case at all. As you can see in the table presented on the screen, designation is actually a legal tool that's used to register designation bylaws on a property, and that lasts in perpetuity. Designated properties also have to go through a heritage permitting process if alterations are being considered that would impact heritage attributes. And in terms of demolition, council really has full control over whether or not a designated property can be demolished. Now, in comparison, when you look at listing on the Heritage Register, there's sort of no change in legal status. There's no process if anybody on the register wants to alter their property. The only control the town really has is that 60-day review period. And for the purpose of comparison, I've also included a column on the status of most of the properties that are now on the Heritage Inventory. And essentially there's no difference between being listed on the Heritage Register or being on the existing inventory other than the 60-day review period. Another myth is that listing prevents demolition and redevelopment. This is not at all the case. Not all properties listed on the Heritage Register are actually expected to be conserved. Really, in fact, many of the properties that have been proposed for the Heritage Register are recognized as being slated for redevelopment. But the inclusion on the Heritage Register does give us that expanded window in the event that a demolition permit does come in. And it's important to recognize that being on the Heritage Register cannot prevent demolition or redevelopment unless council decides to move forward with a full designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. The third myth is that listing results in burdensome requirements for studies and reports. It is true that being on the Heritage Register could result in heritage studies being done or being requested by the town. However, it must be considered that most of these properties are already on the Heritage Inventory and would be subject to requests through any planning applications anyway. A fourth myth is that listing means special approval is required prior to renovations or alterations. I already discussed that, but essentially heritage permits are only required for designated properties. Fifth myth is that listing on the Heritage Register will lower property values. This should not be the case as there's no change in the legal status of the property. And then the sixth myth is that listing on the register will raise insurance costs. And again, this is inaccurate. Insurance costs are really based on the level of risk and the type of coverage. Neither of those things are materially influenced by inclusion on the Heritage Register. So in terms of the transition from the inventory to the Heritage Register, there have been 118 properties that have been identified for, or non-designated properties that have been identified for inclusion on the Heritage Register. The majority of these, 109 of the 118, are already included on the town's existing informal inventory. And a lot of work has been done to assess whether or not these properties are appropriate for inclusion on the Heritage Register. And really, this was conducted using Ontario Regulation 906, which is a number of criteria for determining cultural heritage value or interest. And once we went through the process of evaluating all of these properties, we were able to put together summary profiles for each, which included background information, photographs, a map, and an evaluation matrix of Ontario Regulation 906. So I won't spend much time on this, but just to provide a sort of visual cue to what I'm speaking to, this is the property profile for 34 Arnold Estate. At the top, you can see there's some really general information, which is consistent for all of the profiles. We then get into more in-depth research in terms of both the design value, the historical value, and contextual value. This is all supported with recent photographs of the property. And then there's also a map of the property, and then a matrix which does discuss the evaluation under Reg 906. Now, in order to be considered a property that should be considered for the Heritage Register, there needs to be a hit at least one of the 9 criteria within Ontario Regulation 906. So in terms of moving forward, if authorized by GGC, the rollout would happen immediately. Beginning tomorrow, the packages would be put together to the 118 property owners that appear on the list. These packages would include an introductory letter as well as an invitation to open houses to occur early in October. Each property owner would also get a copy of their property profile sheet and a copy of a brochure that was put together on what it means to be listed on the Heritage Register. There are 3 dates set for open houses, with priority for each open house based on geography. So we'll be looking to tackle the Pickering Village properties first, then the other urban properties outside of Pickering Village, and finally the last open house will be dedicated toward rural properties or greenbelt properties. Once that's been complete, there will be a review of the list of properties at the Heritage Advisory Committee in October, and in November, a report back to CAP to talk about the results of the consultation process. So to conclude, the transition of non-designated heritage properties from the Heritage Inventory to the Heritage Register is an important step towards ensuring that the town of Ajax is suitably positioned to conserve local heritage resources. And the recommendations are that staff be authorized to consult with owners of non-designated properties being considered for inclusion on the Town of Ajax Heritage Register, and that the staff report to CAP in November 2017, that there be a staff report to CAP in November 2017 regarding the input received during the public consultation process. That is it.
Mayor Parrish.
Thank you very much for your report, and thank you for bringing this to committee before going forward. I found it very informative because I wasn't clear on the distinction between designation and having a register, and that clarified a lot of points for me. So if I, having some kind of level of understanding of this, didn't realize that distinction, I can assure you that 99.99% of the population didn't understand that either. So, just in terms of engaging with people, first of all, I take it that some of these properties are really no-brainers. I mean, there's some of them that town owns. I'm not familiar with all the regulations around cemeteries, but one of the things I do know is that they're exempt from kind of any kind of development application. And so I think some of these would just go on the register, I would think, pretty easily. And then you get to these properties where people own these properties because they really cherish the fact that it's a heritage property, and they already consider it a heritage property and will embrace registration, maybe even embrace designation. And then there'll be a lot of people who will go, hold it, this is the major investment in my life. I don't want to jeopardize what I can do with it. I don't want to jeopardize its value. I don't want to jeopardize its insurability, et cetera, et cetera. So when you make these statements that putting it on the registration as opposed to designation will not affect property value or insurability and things like that. Can you prove that? Because a lot of people won't believe you. They'll have their own anecdotal evidence to say, oh, I know a real estate agent, he told me, oh, it'll decrease my property value by 25%. So is there any kind of industry statement either from the Insurance Bureau or from the recognized insurance governing body that basically has dealt with that and has policy on that, so that you can, it won't just be your word against a citizen's word, it'll be, well, as a matter of fact, the Insurance Bureau of Canada says blah, blah, blah. Do you have any information like that?
So through the chair, we do have that information, and actually most of that information pertains to heritage designation. So it's looking at a level of protection that far exceeds what we're looking at with heritage register listing. But the Insurance Bureau of Canada has put out brochures and pamphlets about insuring designated properties and how it shouldn't impact the cost of insurance. At the same time, all of the studies that have been done looking at property values and heritage designation say that there's actually a positive relationship between designation and property value, and that these properties are actually better able to withstand changes in the overall market, and they tend to rise at a faster rate than non-designated properties. So that information absolutely does exist, and I plan to make reference to those existing brochures and that information during any sessions I have in front of the public.
The category of properties that I can see being on the register, but are also properties that you know instinctively are going to be redeveloped. One example, Kings Court Apartments, or Sherwood Apartments, we used to call Kings Court Apartments. We've known that the owner of that property has for some time been floating around proposals to redevelop that. That haven't come to any concrete form yet, but and of course those apartments go right back to the earliest years of the town when they were probably the first back in Queens Court and then Cedar Street, the earliest apartments that existed in this town. So I can see their heritage value, but it's in the downtown where we've got all these other policies that we've adopted, the community improvement plan, et cetera, that encourage redevelopment of our downtown. What do you say to an owner like that?
Well, I would start by saying the evaluation that we do under Reg 906 is really completely neutral on future plans for a property. It's looking at its heritage value. So it's really breaking it down to its historical story, its architecture, and its contextual value. If it is shown to meet any of that, it goes on the list. Now, once it's on the list, that does not mean that there's no opportunity for development in the future. So if it is a property that's been slated for redevelopment, and council has been supportive of that idea already, then that owner should have an understanding that in order to prevent that development, council would have to have done a complete 180 and decided that it was worthy of heritage designation and moving forward in the exact opposite direction. So I think it's very important from the outset to make it very clear that unlike designation, listing on the Heritage Register doesn't prevent demolition. It doesn't prevent redevelopment. It just changes the process a little bit to just ensure that we've done our due diligence before any of these things move forward.
So the one thing it does do is that, okay, I'm an owner of say a residential property that has heritage value, put on the Heritage Register, and I decide that I'm going to do a substantial redevelopment of my property. It'll include partial demolition, and that will trigger me having to get a bunch of studies done at my expense. So that would make me warm and fuzzy, I don't think, towards this process. doing my redevelopment of home is already something that I budgeted for $200,000, and this is going to add another 50 to it. How do you deal with that kind of issue? In other words, is there assistance from the municipality? Would they have to do it anyway in order to get the permits, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, they'd essentially have to do it anyway. If they're already recognized on our heritage inventory, when these planning applications come in, we ask for those studies to be done regardless. And
is that enforceable, asking for them? In other words, we can say, we're asking for them, but if we don't get them, you don't get your permits.
it's enforceable in the way that any report that we ask for under the official plan is enforceable. We clearly outlined what types of reports are required in any given circumstance. And as I mentioned during the presentation, by the definitions in our official plan, these properties that are on our informal inventory are already subject to the heritage policies within our OP. So I would say that they are already enforceable. It's just being on the heritage register makes most of the processes more formal in that it changes the processes as they're put into play. The Ontario Heritage Act is very clear on the 60-day window, for example, for demolition. So this process isn't really adding anything new to the equation. It's just sort of formalizing those processes.
One last question. When you come back in November after going through this process, I take it you'll be recommending perhaps one of a few things, proceeding to take the list and having them put on the register, not proceeding. Is there the possibility that you'd say, of the 129 or whatever the number is, I forget, we think we should proceed with 101, 87?
I think it's far more likely that it's either a recommendation to proceed or not to proceed. The issue with starting to split these properties into different categories is our evaluations have already shown that you either meet or you don't meet Regulation 906. These have been shown to meet. So in terms of then creating new tiers of categories, that's really not working through the processes in place through the Ontario Heritage Act.
And that's actually a subsequent process. When it came time, there was a development application,
Yep.
And then council would have to decide, no, we want to ramp this up. We want to designate this property, or no, we don't think it's on the register, but we think the redevelopment is appropriate and just allow it to proceed with whatever conditions might be necessary.
Exactly. That's accurate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councilor Collard?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Many of my questions were asked. This isn't part of our strategic plan. So I'm wondering, have we already achieved all the planning objectives that are on our strategic plan?
Through the chair.
I would like to say that we have.
Okay. I would like you to say you have too.
But we haven't.
Okay.
We're still working on a number of the objectives. This particular matter was one that we received direction from council to move forward on last year in 2016. And so we are following up on that direction and moving this forward by providing some more detail today on how we are looking at going forward with the consultation and providing the timetable and some more information. But no, we haven't achieved all of our directions under the community strategic plan, but we are working very hard on them, and this is an additional thing that council have asked us to move forward on.
Well, I guess I've knocked on a lot of doors, and we all have, thousands and thousands, and I've never once had somebody say, you know what, I think one of our things should be to add more houses to the heritage designation or any of these things. It looks like a lot of time has been spent on this, and it's ready to go tomorrow. What if we send all these letters out to the residents and there's no interest? What if 75% say no, we don't want any part of this?
So, through the chair. That's essentially what this process is all about. This is about going there, providing the information to these property owners, ensuring that they do have a full understanding of what this means. And if at these public open houses, all the comments are saying one thing, that property owners aren't interested, I'll provide that information to council, and that becomes a council decision as to whether or not to move forward with this, this process. This is something that has been happening since 2005 in municipalities across Ontario. And in terms of Durham Region and other lakeshore municipalities, we are one of the last to sort of formalize our heritage register. So at this point, I think we're sort of catching up. But like I said, it really becomes a council decision. If there isn't support from residents, that information will be shared, and then I imagine that will factor into your decision.
Imagine it will. I thought we'd already captured most of these properties. Like Mayor Parrish made the point that some of these we already know are redevelopment. I think it was numbers 49 through 51 was the Sherwood and the Salvation Army building across the road. We know those are scheduled. So I guess I don't really understand, if we know that, why they're on the list. But I thought a lot of these we'd already captured by designating Pickering Village as a heritage, I don't remember what we called it, but district. Thank you.
So none of the properties included on this list are designated.
Right.
So there is nothing here that's been captured under the Pickering Village Heritage Conservation District. Those are already designated. They're in a separate pile. Now, as far as the properties that are sort of somewhat slated for development already, the reason they are still on the list is, as I mentioned before, the list just captures every property with heritage value, regardless of what its intended future is. The benefit of having those properties on the list is when those applications do come forward, we've got the sort of backup that we need to request for certain heritage studies to be done, so we can document both the history of this property and what will happen going forward. So in some cases it may not be appropriate to preserve the building itself, but it could be appropriate to put up a plaque commemorating the history. That sort of thing often comes out through a heritage impact assessment. That report will say the value of this property isn't architectural, so there's no reason to keep the buildings themselves. Its value is entirely historical. So you can preserve that history or that story through a plaque, through some sort of commemorative display. You know, there's really a range of options that are possible at that point.
All right, well, I suspect this is going to pass, and we'll see what those letters say. Thank you.
Councillor Crawford?
I don't think people who, thank you through the chair, I don't think the people that own these homes necessarily, they're more concerned about value of their homes, they're more concerned about renovation potential. We went through this last term, I think, right, Councillor Dutz? And it was quite a long process, and I would say possibly even hijacked a little bit by certain members, and so it was difficult to convince people that, again, the insurance piece of it was valid, because others were going around saying it wasn't. So really documentation that states that is important in the open houses, because it was, yeah, it's, I don't look forward to this. Personally, I understand why we're doing it. I just remember it's still very vivid from last term. And as long as I don't have to do another video, I'll be there. but yeah, I definitely documentation on the insurance and the property values and all that kind of stuff is really critical to getting the buy-in. I mean, anybody, they'll be happy to put a plaque up, all that stuff, but really it's about what they can do to their home, how much is the town trying to control what I'm doing. That's a lot more of what their concerns are, from my
Through the
experience.
chair, just a quick response on that. I appreciate that information, especially considering I wasn't around during the implementation of the Heritage Conservation District. That work was for a heritage designation, full protection under the Act. This is a little bit different, and you know, I wouldn't call it designation light, but I've heard other people refer to it that way. So it really is quite a different thing, but I imagine the concerns will be exactly the same as they were with the implementation of the district. So I will keep that information
So-
in mind.
May I just ask one question? Sometimes things happen within the village that I kind of scratch my head thinking, I don't think that's what we decided that was supposed to happen. Like flashy signs go up, and I didn't think like those were part of what we had designated as proper signages. I've seen some additions go up thinking that doesn't really look very heritage. So I'm going to take pictures for you, and I'm
Okay.
going to send them to you.
Thank you.
And then you can decide if they're heritage.
Sure.
Councillor Brown?
Yes, thank you. I thought we had 30 days to determine if a building should be demolished at this stage of the game, without this.
So through the chair, for a residential building like a detached home, there's 10 days under the Ontario Building Code. For larger types of building, apartment buildings, larger industrial buildings, there can be between 15 and 20 days depending on the type of building. But 20 days would be the max.
So why at the Heritage meeting did we say, well, they'll have double the amount of time? This is triple.
Yes, I don't remember anyone referring to it as double the amount of time.
Okay. Like right now, council has approved 30 heritage buildings. With this proposal, we're going to have the 30 which we've already approved, but we're approving 105 if we go with this, right? That's what you're going to do because the other applications that they have on the list, that's never been before council. So this is the first time that council will be a part of the Heritage Register, correct?
It's tough to answer. The council has made each decision, each approval for a heritage designation in the past for
Yes,
the
I
30
said, so that's
designations.
30. But
Correct.
the 105 now, we've never seen as a council.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. And does that give somebody that is in opposition to a development another tool to slow the process down for development? Does it give anybody a tool that...
I wouldn't say it gives anybody a tool. I mean, the information, really as I mentioned before, most of these properties have already been added to the informal inventory. So there's already a record out there of them having heritage value. This is just really changing their status in a way, but it doesn't provide any new tools.
No, thank you, Bill. Some of those that you're putting on, I think it's 9 hits for determining what one.
Yes.
Some of them only have 1.
Right.
So Sherwood Gardens, I don't know how many hits that has. Well, it doesn't have any in my opinion, but it didn't have it in 1953, didn't it? Anyway, so I think that, you know, to designate like registered with only 1 hit that it says that it's architecturally valuable, heritage-wise, I think, and making them be responsible for a report that could cost, you said, from $2,000 to $5,000. I mean, I think that puts an unnecessary burden on the home.
So my response would be, as I mentioned before, that these properties are already on the inventory, so they'd already be requested.
No, not all of them, not all of them.
You're right, not all of them, the
For
majority
instance,
of
the
them.
gardens has, and then there was a lot that haven't, I think it's 30, is it, that this got additional on the list of this register list or whatever the heck it is.
There are 118 properties proposed to move forward. 109 of those are on the existing inventory.
The staff one, the staff one.
Correct.
So, and now we're going to approve 130 council.
118 is the list. But so of that 118, there are 9 that aren't currently on the staff informal inventory. The reason they're not on the informal inventory is because they've only been discovered or they've only been evaluated recently. So
how many of them only have 1 hit architecture?
I could go through and I could find out, but Regulation 906 is very clear in saying that only one hit needs to happen. And I think what's more important is to be added to a heritage register, there's no need to apply Ontario Regulation 906. You don't have to really have any documentation of a property's value. The only thing you need to have is a sense that there's potential for heritage value. Regulation 906 was developed as a way to evaluate properties for full heritage designation. So we've set the bar higher already with our heritage register than many municipalities have.
Okay, well, I can guarantee that 99% of them will be in opposition, and they're not in my ward. So I'm opposed to this because I think it will put an unnecessary burden on some people. And I have not been a part of the whole list. I have been a part of the 30 that have been designated and agreed with that. But there's a lot on this 118 that I do not agree with, so I will not be supporting it. Thank you.
Councillor Jordan.
Well, I have concerns with this. I remember the last, and I know there's a difference. You've explained that, but I don't know that people will understand that difference, nor will they believe it, even with all the information available. And some of these, I'm concerned with some of these, and it's the apartments on King's Crescent, Harwood, that they have a lot of ticks. And I think even though, we know it doesn't, it's not going to affect the process, or you say that, I'm concerned that it gives, we know there's been people come out when something's being redeveloped, and they want it saved for whatever reason that they believe very strongly in, and usually they use heritage. This looks to me like it gives people an opportunity to really fight hard to prevent the redevelopment, and politically it puts us in a really bad position. I also think that as an outsider, if I saw this list and saw that council had approved some of these to be on the heritage register, they would think we had totally lost our minds. And I think I would tend to agree with them. I think, and I'm also concerned about where we are. Councillor Collier spoke about the strategic plan. That was our priorities. I'm hesitant to start something at the end of the term when we haven't completed things that are already in place that we wanted to do. And also to designate some of our own properties. I wonder about that as well. I mean, it seems to me if you had the list at a staff level, if something was going forward, you would bring it forward in a report, and you could choose to do it that. I mean, I think we've done that in different places. I don't know if it needs to be as formal as this. Those are my comments.
Mayor Parrish?
Well, I'm going to move the recommendation. As councilors will know, this was originally going to come to a CAP meeting a week ago or so, or interview day. And I had concerns that this was going to ramp things up in a way that was not appropriate before council seeing this report, having this discussion, knowing the political sensitivities about it, timing, et cetera, all the points which have been raised, and appropriately so. But I think that council needs to be aware that we do have right now an informal inventory. 90% of the properties on this I would go through with individual members of council, and they'd go, agreed, agreed, agreed. There'd be a few where individual councilors would go, well, why would we want to keep an old wartime building? Why would we want to keep the old Kingscourt apartments? Why would we? And the answer to that is, we're not keeping them. We're putting them on a register that says that wartime building on Mackenzie, when an application for its owner to build a brand new factory on that site comes forward, it would be identified that this building was built in 1941 and it housed line D of the DIL workers that filled these kinds of shells, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And council will go, oh yeah, okay, so we need to commemorate that. We need to preserve some form of that, and we need to get some more information of exactly what was done there. And we think at the end of the day that redeveloping that site to take it from 50 jobs to 100 jobs is the right thing to do. So there's a lot of, like, Councilor Brown in her comments interchanged the register and designation several times. And that, of course, is what a lot of us do in our head, and that's what the public does in our head. All we're doing right now is authorizing a process, authorizing a dialogue. Some of us think we know what the end result of that dialogue will be. No, 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 no. And if that's the end result of the dialogue, and we as political creatures think, you know what, I don't want to go there and there. I don't want to go down that tunnel right now, or maybe ever. Then on November 3rd, that's what council will decide in light of the experience, in light of the exchange, in light of the questions, in light of the report, in light of our own gut feelings. But I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to do as much as we can to have as accurate as possible inventory and setup as to our built cultural heritage. I know from my experience with this council, probably more than any other previous councils, that we have gone a long way in saying, you know, built heritage is important. St. Francis, Quaker Meeting Hall. I could list, you know, Post-Inn. I could list quite a number, and it's a fairly impressive record. If we didn't have something that identified these things and said, these need to be looked at carefully before authorizing any further steps, I don't know if we'd be serving ourselves, our history, our cultural and built heritage well. So we're authorizing, by passing this motion, we're authorizing a process. We're not authorizing going ahead, come back on November 3rd, the politics is too hot or whatever, we can decide not to proceed. But to decide not to proceed today, without going through that, I'm not comfortable with. So I will move it and support it, and we're doing what it says, a process that will culminate on November the 3rd.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Just quickly, I mean, I guess I didn't really understand the difference either, but I'm still not convinced. I think we're basically kicking a hornet's nest here. I think I haven't heard anything from residents ever to want to move something like this forward. Nothing. And I've represented Pickering Village for 14 years. I mean, it's the local and the regional. So I've had a lot of opposition, and one thing we're really promoting is jobs and attracting business, and every development that's ever come in Pickering Village, and I'm thinking of that spot right across from Durham Music, has been jumped all over like crazy, and nothing's happened there in all this time. And I think I agree with Councilor Brown. I mean, I don't want to add another obstacle. I don't want to add another step, especially since, you know, all this is really, I don't think people understand it. I don't think it's necessary at this point. So, I mean, Steve gives a great argument, but I'm not supporting it today. Thank you.
Any other further comments or questions? Just have a few. So this was basically the wish list as we knew it in the town of Ajax. We had a wish list of properties that we had felt there was some heritage value too. However, that wish list didn't have the information on the properties, if I recall. Not all the properties did. Because if you went to the next step to designate the property as a heritage site, then you would hire the consultant to do all that background information. So would that have to be done again if they were drawn from this new list?
Absolutely. If the decision was to move forward with designation at some point, we would still go through the process as it's always been set out, and as you mentioned, that does include acquiring a heritage consultant to give a fulsome history of the property and a full sort of understanding of its heritage value. Now, what we have in place with this document is sort of the first step to that. So it really, I think it cuts back on the work that the heritage consultant would have to do, because we've done a little of the legwork at the front end of this process.
So how many sites are we, the average per year, are we designating in the town of Ajax?
We've been designating properties since at least I think the early 1980s was the first designation. So, you know, when you prorate it, we're looking at a designation a year kind of situation. I don't believe there have been any designations since the district designation back in 2014.
So we're not going to be able to speed through this list just because we have a new inventory list. So basically all this list does is gives us protection from somebody demolishing a property when we don't really have enough time to react and get the information that we would need if we wanted to go that step further and designate it to prevent it from being demolished.
Correct, and I think a perfect example of why this list could be so valuable is looking at some of the development pressures we've seen along Kingston Road, for example, through the village. There have been applications for fairly significant properties. The St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church that I showed on one of the earlier slides, there was at pre-con a few months back, there was an application that proposed that that building, as well as some other historical buildings, be demolished and replaced with townhomes. If they had come forward with a demolition permit, we would have had 10 days to figure out what we're doing. Is that valuable enough to designate, or is it not? Really, the value of the Heritage Register is that 10 days, or sorry, that would have been more than 10 days because it wasn't a residential building. It might have been 15 or 20 days. But still, with this list in place, we would have been given 60 days, which is, you know, at least 3 times the amount of time to do our due diligence and get a full understanding of its value.
And I think some of us were surprised what happened on the West Glen property, on Westney Road, the Westney house, where there was demolition done on the property, whether, you know, you agreed or disagreed as to what was taken down. It was just that they went ahead and did it without any.
Right, and that's a designated property as well, so that's a whole nother matter, because it is designated. But what I think,
so this makes it very clear, though, when you have this inventory for those properties, it makes it very clear what the process is, so there's no kind of gray areas.
I think that's accurate.
So, and I just wanted to comment too on the Village Heritage District, because I agree there were questions and concerns about the insurance and about the value of the properties. But they were very, I mean, staff really responded well to those queries, and we had a lot of phone calls, and staff did their research, and they were able to present really factual information. So when it came time to approve that, we really had nobody asking those questions at that meeting. So, you know, they did a really, really good job at, you know, making people feel more comfortable with the process. So I understand why there's concerns about the process of pulling out of the inventory. But my concern too, and we'll hear that too, and we'll reevaluate it perhaps, but I guess my concern is that the owner now will not always be the owner in the future as well. So it's a form of protection that way. What would be, do you know what the cost of getting out of the process would be? General ballpark?
Ballpark.
For an owner?
As Pat mentioned, we discussed at the previous Heritage Committee meeting about the cost of the types of reports that we would typically require. It's usually, I would say, in the range of $2,000, depending on the complexity of the property. That goes up. But if somebody is listed, if this moved forward and someone was to be listed as a non-designated property on the Heritage Register, and they wanted to demolish their property or just get themselves off the list, they would have to provide a cultural heritage evaluation report, which would give us more in-depth research on the value of the property and on its history. So as I was saying, I think those reports generally can be done for around $2,000. Depending on the consultant, it could be higher than that, it could be lower than that.
So all of that will be reevaluated after the public
I said 2
consultation.
to 5 in committee.
Sorry?
Pardon?
I said you said 2 to 5 in committee.
Yeah, I said, and it can be upwards, it can be downwards. I was looking at the range of what we've had in the past for more complex properties as well. The bulk of the properties on this list are residential properties.
Right.
And those tend to be handled, like I said, in the range of about $2,000. We also have a few properties on the candidate list that have multiple buildings. These are almost campuses of buildings.
So basically, this will open up the dialogue surrounding this process as well. So we'll hear both sides of that, which is good. And I would assume also that your list, as time goes by, I mean, you may have missed some properties and it may increase.
That's the idea. Anytime a property would be added to the list, it would have to go to council. So there is, because this is all a very regimented process, if this were to move forward through the Ontario Heritage Act, there's a very clear understanding of what needs to happen, either for a property to be added, a property to be removed, or a property to be granted permission for demolition.
Well, I fully support this recommendation, and I've been on the Heritage Advisory Committee, and I thank the committee for the work they've done, and the work you've done in the research on the properties on this inventory is pretty extensive. We've talked about it for many years, getting this list updated and more formalized. The province has put that protection in the legislation, and a lot of municipalities are going there. We're going a little bit the extra mile with the consultations, which is always problematic sometimes. There are a lot of questions, a lot of confusion, and afraid that we're going to limit them on any renovations, that kind of thing. And every municipality is different, and we're trying to make it easy. So, I really feel it's important to protect our heritage, built heritage and otherwise. And we've shown that in our support of other buildings, and particularly with support of the DIL history here, which started this town. So I think I think when you'll hear about it is when something disappears, and then it's too late. And that's usually the way. So I appreciate the work you put into this. Councillor Ashby, you had a
Thanks, Madam Chair. I don't have an issue with this. I think staff is simply asking for authorization to embark on a process to catalog our inventory. And if and when development opportunities present themselves, we would have already done a lot of the work, and it'll make it a little painless at the time for whatever councillor is there. So I really don't have an issue with this, so I'll support it.
Mr. Jordan?
I just want to make an amendment, that we pull out 49, 50, 51. That's what do you call those?
Sherwood Gardens.
Sherwood Gardens.
And Salvation Army.
And the Salvation Army.
Well, 50 is the Salvation Army.
Yeah.
Well, if we're doing that, there's some others that we know about.
Well, I haven't had
I
time
mean,
to go through every one, but
Are we
those
gonna
ones.
vote? Shall we pick it up?
Well, those ones to me, I just think.
There's a few more on the list if we want to take out known ones.
Well, if we start doing that, there won't be any left.
Well, I would point out just to Councilor Jordan, and I have some sympathy with their point, but if you look at the check marks, there's a lot of them for Kings Court Apartments, and
Queen's Court.
Well, if you look at this, there's a lot with only one check mark.
yeah, but I mean, the point is that as I think staff has said, these are ones that meet the criteria in even one point. If we start going through this list, there'll be ones that have much fewer checks, where we'll go, oh, that one should be, I mean, and I'm just speaking for myself, but I'm not a heritage expert, and this is a part of a process that will flesh this out, so. And you know what? When it comes back, if it goes out and it comes back to council, there'll be plenty of opportunity then to say, I don't think 49, 50, and 51 should be on the list, and that can be a matter of debate then. Anyways.
Park it on here.
So you want to put a motion?
Put the motion on the amendment.
Do I have any, we vote on the motion then?
This is the main motion.
The amendment.
This is
The
the
amendment is to take out 49 to 51.
49, 50, and 51?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. All in favor? Any opposed? Anyone in favor is carried, right?
I didn't think it was going to be so close. All opposed. I thought that was an easy one.
So what did we get here?
It
With-
was
lost.
I thought it was 3.
You're not in favor of taking them out?
No, if
Okay.
we're going to do it,
All right,
do it.
okay, that's fine.
Okay, in favor of the main motion then? In favor? Any opposed? It's carried. Thank you. So hopefully we get this all flushed out.
I'll need it.
I hope this isn't one of these times we go for consultation and do the opposite.
3 days in a row.
So,
Like Parkside.
3 days in a row.
I need a motion to move in camera
3 days in a
unless you
row.
want a break.
Well, you know what, you can go on the...
5 minutes?